Start with Mr. Genuis for 6 minutes, please. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to both of our witnesses, and thank you for the opportunity that we have with this important meeting to discuss the issue of Indigenous procurement and some of the abuses that we have heard about through the Arrive scam scandal initially, and now through some further investigations that have been done. And we've heard from Indigenous leaders who have said that there is a significant problem in this Indigenous procurement space with companies that are either not Indigenous or perhaps some misuse of the rules that allow the primary beneficiaries to be non-Indigenous companies. And this is the spirit in which we're engaging in this important study. I'll start with a question to the Ghost Warrior Society. So I think there are probably three distinct categories we can look at of abuse or potential abuse when it comes to Indigenous procurement. One is just complete fabrication or misrepresentation by a company about Indigenous identity. Another is the misuse of joint ventures, where you have officially a joint venture gaining advantage of a contract that's been set aside for Indigenous peoples, but in effect, the virtually all of the benefit from that contract is going to the non-Indigenous partner. And then you have the kind of case of contracting or subcontracting and subcontracting, where you have a kind of a very small shell company getting contracts and then subcontracting all the work and subcontracting to non-Indigenous companies. So in all of these different kinds of cases, but we're seeing efforts by the government to say they've checked a box in terms of Indigenous procurement, but substantively the no or very limited benefit is going to Indigenous peoples. And part of the problem we see behind this is that the government is maintaining its own list of Indigenous businesses that is not consistent with lists that are put together by Indigenous organizations themselves. So I want to just drill down on the Indigenous procurement issue. Why do you think the federal government would maintain their own list? And why is the federal government struggling to actually define parameters of a program that would see Indigenous peoples being the primary beneficiaries?
Through our initial forays and research into this multifaceted issue, the problem is there is no unified or central body that regulates that authenticates Indigenous identity or monitors, these agreements once they have been set up. And when you define First Nations, Métis, and Inuit identity, that varies from region to province to territory, federally, provincially, and there's just no central body that oversees everything. There's a lot of piecemeal efforts being made across the country. For instance, there's something that's academic specific. There is something that's specific to arts and culture. There is something specific to economic development. And here with procurement, that's only 5%. So when you look at non-Indigenous, interest, they already have 95% of the market. And for them to have exploitations and considerable impact on that remaining 5% that is remaining for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, this is a travesty for sure. And there needs to be some more concrete measures, some more meaningful sanctions put into place for those who abuse the system.
And just to follow up on that, I think some members of the government will say, and they have said in past meetings, well, identity can be really complicated, and there can be marginal or ambiguous cases, and there might be some cases where different Indigenous peoples disagree about kind of how that identity is precisely defined. But I think there are also many clear-cut cases we've seen, cases where the federal government isn't keeping track of subcontracts. So they're supposed to have this rule that when there's an Indigenous procurement set aside, a certain percentage of the subcontracts are Indigenous, and there's no tracking of that whatsoever. And that seems not so much like responding to difficulty, but sheer negligence and disregard for the results. How do you make of this? What do you make of this lack of tracking of information that we've seen?
When it comes to the issue of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit identity fraud, there is a lot of work to be done to displace the self-identification of Indigenous identity. Self-identification is one model that has been in place for decades, since early 1990s. and it's problematic and has always been subject to failure and exploitation. The problem with self-identification is it relies on an honor system, and as we know that there are many interests out there who are not honorable and will bend the rules, lie, and misrepresent themselves in favor of economic gain. So without a authoritative body to really oversee all of these facets, right down from conception all the way to development, project delivery, and maintenance, then there will continue to
And
be.
just quickly on that question of an authoritative body, I mean, wouldn't it be simpler for the federal government just to have engaged Indigenous organizations that are working on these issues of Indigenous business already, rather than try to create their own processes or lists that are separate from the people that are Indigenous themselves and are already doing this work?
I think a problem that's systemic across, colonial, when dealing with colonial governments, is they always say that whatever is out there to define First Nations, Métis, Inuit identity must be led by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. However, that is not the case. We have colonial interference in all levels of government and across all sectors, and without the leadership from First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, there are going to be shortfalls, and there's going to be exploitations continuing well into the future.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Atwin, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us today. I know a lot of, I will have to say, our witnesses, what you say will be put into our reports. There's a lot of preamble here from some of our committee members making certain assertions or assumptions, but really it's what you're bringing to the table that we really appreciate for this important study. So I'd just like to ask really quickly for the Ghost Warrior Society, when were you approached to present at the committee today?
A couple weeks ago.
Okay, do you have the exact date?
That would have been after the global news story of October 28th. Oh, September 28th, okay. Sorry. Just a few days in advance of September 30th. Every Child Matters Indigenous Recognition Day. And it was the week following. I cannot pinpoint an exact date, probably the Tuesday or Wednesday after.
Okay, thank you very much. And I do want to direct most of my questions to Mr. Caragnel, specifically because Plato originated in New Brunswick. That's my home province. I've been able to witness firsthand some of the incredible work that's done with Plato, specifically with youth in particular as well. But if you could just start us off, what are the main barriers to economic development for First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities? What are those unique barriers that are faced by communities?
I can speak mainly to some of the barriers that exist in the technology space, and they're because it's quite a large question. But when it comes to the technology space, part of it is really there's not that much awareness of the opportunities that exist in terms of pursuing livelihood in technology in many of our communities. If we go out to our communities, we see that a lot of the youth are very comfortable with technology. They are utilizing a lot of the skills that would be useful in an employment or a career context. But sort of having I would call it the role models to follow. There just aren't very many inside of technology. So if you look at where a lot of our post-secondary students or entering the post-secondary system go, they tend to go where there are people that they already know. So we got a lot of folks that are entering programs in social work or addictions counseling or education or nursing, where there are already people from the community that are in those roles and that are succeeding, and that they've provided sort of a path to follow, and they're kind of known commodities. But when it comes to technology services, quite often the technology that comes into our communities comes in as a product you buy or a product you download from the internet, and the path for how you actually can find that career isn't as clear. What we have found over the course of the last 8 years with our own program is that we really work with local Indigenous training organizations, community counselors, post-secondary institutions, that kind of thing, to try and find individuals that are interested in careers in technology. And usually that's the first thing we ask is, why do you want to do this? And folks will tell us, well, I've always had a computer on my desk, or I, do my own digital media programming, or I do, I have a business that I offer services to individuals. that's that initial desire is what we look for, and then we're also looking for skills that are important in our industry. So the ability to think critically, to follow logical thought patterns, the ability to communicate, and then we take that, we run them through a 20-week program. And inside of that program, it's basically everything you need to know to be a successful entrant to the career space as a technology tester in Canada. And the program includes technical skills training, sort of things you need to know and be able to do, but also professional skills. How do you interact as a consultant with a development team that may be situated in Lisbon, Portugal, and there may be language barriers and things like that. So we do try to develop that. And then we try to remove barriers by offering a guaranteed employment offer for those that successfully complete the program. And then we wrap our arms around folks and using that apprenticeship model and providing ongoing coaching and mentorship support for the first couple of years. But to answer your question, what we do see is that with the people that we've had that have successfully joined our company and are working away, it becomes way easier to recruit from their communities and their families, because all of a sudden there's somebody there that I know. And you know what? Maybe I'd like to do what Auntie does or what Uncle does. And the next thing you know, we've got multiple members from the same community. Sometimes we have multiple members of the same family that take subsequent training courses. And for myself, as if I look at it through a policy lens, the best way to get our youth into more STEM-related studies in the university is to actually have people they know that are succeeding in those career spaces, and that will help generate a pathway for building that pipeline.
Absolutely. I've got such limited time, so I've got about a minute left in this round. But I was going to ask about that impact and what that means, and you really eloquently spoke to some of that. Just even in one family, for example, some of the impacts, the ripple effects that can be seen, and specifically that the piece of Plato where you've got that employment offer at the end. Can you speak to how important that is specifically?
The idea was really to remove barriers. And when you look at most of us got our first job because we knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody, and that helped us get us in the door. But if there are no other members of communities that are in the technology space, it's harder to do. So the idea was to remove the initial barrier. And then the second one was through our training program, you start to develop that initial network of professional people inside of the space. Because quite often we're there to solve problems. You might run into a situation where you don't know the answer. First thing you do is reach out to somebody you know that say, have you seen this before? Can we use that? We see that offer of employment. Originally, I guess we designed it as part of a carrot to get people through the course, but really we think it's a way of actually putting our money where our mouth is, in the sense that, we say we're going to offer that employment. It is an offer. People are free to accept. Once they completed the training, they're free to accept any other offer. If they get a better deal from a different company, they're free to accept that. But our guarantee to the trainees is that we will offer you that employment. And most accept it, probably because inside of that training cohort, there's a community that's established. And then that community becomes the first professional network that exists within the same enterprise.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.